countdown, we have Nanny Doss. Nanny Doss, otherwise known as Nancy Hazel, was a seemingly innocent and sweet woman. But what people didn't know was that she took the lives of almost a dozen people between 1920 to 1954. She targeted people all across the South and Midwest, including her own family members. She apparently poisoned 4 of her husbands, her 2 sisters, her grandson, her mother-in-law, and her mother. She may have also poisoned her daughters. All were killed for different reasons. Some for money, some to avoid caring for them, etc. What's creepy is that she was nicknamed the Giggling Grandma. Why? Well, because every time she would tell the story of how she killed her late husbands, she laughed hysterically. In our 9th spot, we have Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre was a French lawyer who eventually became one of the most influential figures of the French Revolution. At first, he started out as a strong and great leader, until he became obsessed with the guillotine. He started encouraging more and more people to become executed. More than 17,000 enemies of the revolution were killed as a result, or anyone suspected to be an enemy. So basically, innocent people were killed. That's not all. In a span of 10 months, he took the lives of over 40,000 people, which is absolutely insane. That's like killing 4,000 people a month. Another point is that he lived by the motto, killing is better than forgiving, which is something a psychopath would say. Moving on to number 8, we have Henri Désiré Landru. Henri was a French serial killer who took the lives of at least 7 women between 1915 to 1919. He did so by placing ads in newspapers pretending to be a wealthy widower who was interested in meeting a new bride. A lot of women who had lost their husbands in World War I responded to this ad thinking that it was meant to be, like how easy, and he's got money. Sadly, they would be lured to his home, robbed, and then killed. After doing so, they were dismembered and burned in the oven. Very gruesome, I know. He was finally caught when the sister of one of his victims tracked him down and convinced police that he was the one who killed her sister. And she was right. He was convicted in November of 1921 and sentenced to death by the guillotine. Moving on to number 7, we have Harold Shipman, aka Dr. Death. He was given this name because he was a doctor that killed at least 218 of his patients. So he was practicing in London from 1972 to 1998. During this time, he would kill innocent patients. In fact, he is said to be one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Like, imagine going to a hospital thinking that they're going to save you, and instead, they kill you. He wasn't caught until people were like, wow, a lot of elderly women die when you're on duty. What's up with that? And then they noticed that his name was on a number of cremation certificates. So they got suspicious of him, and he was later caught and convicted in 2000. In our 6th spot today, we have Jane Topman. Here we have another medical professional who was also a serial killer. Jane Topman was a medical nurse fascinated with death. To others, she seemed like a dedicated, hardworking, and loving nurse. But in reality, she conducted a number of experiments on her patients. For example, she would give them a bunch of different drugs just to see what they would do to them. She also had the tendency to push her patients right to the edge of death and then bring them back to life and then kill them again. And then she developed this unhealthy obsession with autopsies. Jane was arrested in 1901 and admitted to taking the lives of 31 individuals, although the number could be much higher. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with Vera Renzi. She was a Romanian serial killer given the name the Black Widow. This was due to the fact that she killed her 2 husbands as well as her multiple lovers. It's believed that she poisoned and killed at least 35 individuals, including her own son. And that's because her son was onto her and one day found coffins in the wine cellar and was like, I'm gonna call the police on you, mom. So she poisoned him to keep him from doing so. Later, the police grew suspicious of her because of the disappearance of one of her lovers. They investigated her home and found 32 unburied zinc-lined coffins, each containing a male corpse. She was then arrested and confessed to everything. In our 4th spot today, we have Emperor Caligula. Now, this dude was the 3rd emperor during the Roman Empire, and he literally was insane. Like, the stuff he did is just the definition of disturbing. Like, I don't think they can teach you about what he did in history class. It's that bad. So this guy was known to do messed up things to his prisoners. Like, he would grill them alive or chew on their no-go parts. He also just liked killing people for fun, or watching people get tortured. In particular, he enjoyed watching innocent people get killed and eaten by wild animals. He was so crazy, people thought like he had some sort of ailment, and that's what was causing him to do these things and be so messed up. In our third spot, we have Vlad the Impaler. Now, this dude was known as the real-life Dracula. In fact, the character Dracula was loosely based off of him. Like, in order for you to have a monster created off of you, you have to be a monster yourself. So this guy would do dark things like dip his bread in the blood of his enemies and then enjoy it. That's where the legend of Dracula sucking blood came from, because he would suck the blood out from his soggy bread. But he is most famously known for impaling his victims, hence why he's called Vlad the Impaler. This guy would impale people to death, just shove them on the stick so that it would come out their mouth, and then just leave them there. It's said that between 1448 to 1462, he killed about 20% of the population, which is a lot. Moving on to number 2, we have Shiro Ishii. Now, the things that this man got away with are disgusting. He's literally the definition of mad scientist. So in 1936, this dude built a huge compound to perform a number of disturbing experiments in. This place was called Unit 732. Some experiments included getting women pregnant by his fellow scientists and then cutting open these women to study them while pregnant. He was also known to amputate limbs and then reattach them to other parts of the victims' bodies, or he would freeze body parts so that he could study what would happen if you didn't treat gangrene. Trust me, it gets worse. Other prisoners were his test subjects for grenades and flamethrowers. Everything he did was horrific, and he was sadistic. He loved torturing people and running disturbing experiments on them. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Pol Pot. Pol Pot was the Prime Minister of Cambodia from 1976 to 1979. During his reign, he cleansed a fourth of his own nation. He wanted to destroy the civilization and turn it into a new age. So he ordered a genocide against his whole country. As a result, millions of Cambodians were displaced, tortured, and killed. Others were forced to work in a field fertilized by human bodies. And if you stopped working, you would either be punished by not being fed or by death. And if you made a mistake while working, you were also killed. Many people literally worked themselves to death. I could do a whole top 10 list on the dark things that this man has done. Like, it's that much, you know? He literally killed up to 3 million Cambodians. That's literally 25 to 33% of his country.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Rose West. Rose West is an English serial killer who committed her crimes alongside her husband. He definitely also would make a spot on this list, but he decided to take his own life in 1995 after being arrested while awaiting trial. The terrible pair were investigated and subsequently arrested for taking 9 lives together, with Rose receiving an additional charge for another 10th life. During the court proceedings, against the advice of her counsel, Rose decided that she would testify herself, and what a trip that was. During her testimony, she sometimes was very tearful and dramatic, but of course an act like that can be hard to keep up, so other times she was cracking jokes and laughing. Imagine doing your Type 5 while you're on trial for the worst of the worst crimes. Luckily, it seems as though the jury hated that as much as I do, because they came back with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all 10 crimes. Get this though, in prison, Rose West met Myra Hindley, which if you don't know who that is, she committed a bunch of very similar crimes with her husband as well, and the two became besties and even had an affair, but throughout this whole thing, Rose is still trying to say that she was totally innocent and that Fred was completely responsible for all of the crimes. So wild. In our number 9 spot today, we have Dennis BTK Raider. The BTK killer, whose real name is Dennis Raider, was one of the worst serial killers from 1974 to 1991. He left taunting letters for police and newspapers where he described his crimes, but thankfully this annoyingly large and misplaced ego is what led to his demise. After a 10-year hiatus from his disgusting crimes, he couldn't keep his mouth shut, so he began communicating with the media again in 2004. This communication, combined with his lack of knowledge on how technology works, led to his arrest in 2005. During his trial, he didn't apologize for his crimes, but he did describe them in full detail, which is horrifying and extremely eerie. I could not even imagine having to be there during that. After his trial, he ended up being sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years. When Raider was first arrested, when the police were taking him to the station, an officer asked him, "Mr. Raider, do you know why you're going downtown?" To which he replied, "Oh, I have suspicions why. In our number 8 spot today we have Randy Kraft. Also known as the Scorecard Killer, Randy is a monster who took the lives of at least 16 young men between 1972 and 1983. The Scorecard nickname comes from how, after his arrest, police found a coded list that contained cryptic references to his crimes and the victims. On May 14, 1983, 2 California Highway Patrol officers observed a car driving erratically and suspected that the driver may be impaired, so they pulled it over. Once the car pulled over, Randy Kraft got out and identified himself and subsequently failed all field sobriety tests. At this same time, the other officer went over to the passenger side where he sadly found Randy's final victim, 25-year-old Marine Terry Lee Gambrell. The next 2 days of investigation revealed the horrors of what Kraft had done, and on May 16, 1983, he was formally charged with the one crime, but many more charges came in the next months. His trial first began on September 26, 1988, and on August 11, 1989, the jury rendered a verdict of death, and the sentence was upheld. As of this year, he still remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he continues to deny any responsibility for the crimes. Like they didn't find one of his victims in the passenger seat of his car. I think the gimmick might be up, Randy. In our number 7 spot today we have the Sleepy Hollow Killer. Starting in 1997, there were a series of killings in an area of South Africa that are all believed to be linked to one unidentified suspect who is being called the Sleepy Hollow Killer. During this time, it was believed that 13 crimes could be attributed to this person, and despite investigations, whoever the perpetrator was, authorities were unable to identify them. There was a small hiatus from the crimes, which is sometimes referred to as a cooling off period, but in 2007 they unfortunately began again. While the more recent crimes varied slightly from the originals, authorities believe it is the same person, active yet again. There has only been one public suspect in this case, but unfortunately it is no longer believed that he had anything to do with these crimes, and that the one he committed was entirely separate. It really is horrifying to think of people who do things like this being able to get away with it for a number of years, so let's just hope that they are caught very soon. The good news is that a special task team has been formed in order to really look into these crimes and explore and examine all of the circumstances, modus operandi, and all of the material evidence. In our number 6 spot today we have Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. This is a double whammy because unfortunately both of these people are still alive, but the good news is that at least one of them, Paul, is still in jail. This horrible pair are often referred to as the Ken and Barbie Killers, and while Paul started off living a life of crime, he quickly brought Karla into it as well after their meeting. That is not to say she is not just as guilty as him, however, because they are both fully responsible for their own actions. While Paul was arrested for a multitude of crimes, the pair were arrested and convicted of taking the lives of 3 separate people, one of them being Karla's sister. See what I meant about them both being responsible for their own actions? The investigation into the crimes proved to be quite difficult, with authorities having plenty of hoops to jump through, and this is why a plea deal was created for Karla. She had 1 week to accept or decline the deal, which would give her a sentence of 12 years for her full cooperation. She accepted. Both were convicted in 2005, and Paul was up to apply for parole in 2018, and in October of that year he was denied parole. His next parole hearing was recently on June 22nd of this year, and it only took an hour of deliberation to decide to turn down that application as well. I think 30 seconds probably would have been enough to decide, but I'm just glad the outcome was the same. Karla, on the other hand, served her 12-year sentence and then was released, like years ago. She moved away from Canada and headed to Costa Rica for a while with her new husband and children, if you can believe that. But unfortunately she has since moved back. In our number 5 spot today we have Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper is an American serial killer who was convicted for taking the lives of 10 people, including his paternal grandparents, as well as his own mother. Wikipedia told me that he is noted for his height, as he is 6 foot 9 inches, and for his intelligence, as he apparently has an IQ of 145, but I personally think that he is most notable for being an absolute monster. His first crime took place when he was just 15 years old, and that was when he took the lives of his grandparents. After this crime, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and spent time in a hospital before it was determined he was rehabilitated, and he was released at the age of 21. After his release, he unfortunately went on a spree where he would target young females who were hitchhiking. After his final crimes, he ended up confessing and turning himself in, which is something we really don't see all of the time. When asked in an interview why he confessed, he said, "The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. 3 court-appointed psychiatrists examined and observed him and found him to be legally sane, and thus he was able to stand trial. On November 8, 1973, the jury deliberated for just 5 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. He has been eligible for parole since 1979 and has been denied every single time he applied, one time saying, "Society is not ready in any shape or form for me." I can't fault them for that. He is eligible to apply for parole again next in 2024. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Long Island serial killer. Also known as the Craigslist Ripper, the LISK is an unidentified suspect who is believed to have taken the lives of somewhere between 10 to 16 people over the last 20 years. The victims so far that are known have been sex workers who use Craigslist to advertise their work. After the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert, police were searching an area along the Ocean Parkway, and that is when they began to discover the remains of the victims. The first 4 were found in December of 2010, with another 6 being found in March and April of 2011. As of December 2015, the FBI is now officially involved in the investigation. There has been a suspect in the case, but any formal charges have not been laid in terms of these crimes. The most recent evidence in regards to these cases was a belt found at the scene of the crime, which may potentially belong to the killer. At this same time, it was announced that new scientific evidence was being used in the investigation, but these announcements came just last year, so we have yet to receive any further updates. Hopefully the case is solved quickly so that the families of the victims can receive justice and this terrible person is off the streets for good. In our number 3 spot today, we have Robert Pikon. This horrible person is one of the worst Canadians to ever live and is one of our country's worst serial killers ever. Pikon dropped out of school and began working at his family's pig farm, and this is where most of his absolutely horrific crimes took place. He was first arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007 of taking the lives of 6 people, but throughout an extremely lengthy investigation, evidence of many more killings came to light. Unfortunately, in 2010, the Crown stayed the rest of the charges, but I suppose at least he was convicted of the 6 he was initially charged with. During his time in jail, an undercover police officer posed as his cellmate, and Pikon confessed to 49 crimes to him. Apparently, he was saying to the undercover officer that he wanted to take one more life to make it an even 50, and that he only got caught because he was sloppy. Which is super ironic, considering you're confessing your crimes to an undercover officer. The entire trial was a bit of a mess, but it led to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which was the longest possible sentence under Canadian law at that time. This unfortunately does mean that he will be eligible for parole within the next decade, so here's hoping that that never ever happens. In our number 2 spot today, we have Peter Tobin. Peter Tobin is a serial killer who was convicted for 3 separate crimes, but it is believed his crimes may actually be up in the range of 40 to 50. Before being convicted of these crimes, Peter also served another 10-year prison sentence for other crimes committed, and he was released from prison for those crimes in 2004. 3 years later, however, he was sentenced to life with a minimum of 21 years for taking the life of Angelica Kluk in 2006. After this, remains of 2 more people who went missing in 1991 were found in his former home, and he was also tried for these crimes, which ended up solidifying his sentence to a whole life order, which means he will never be up for parole. There are some who believe Tobin is responsible for more unsolved crimes, and he has been labeled a psychopath by a senior psychologist. Apparently, while in prison, he has boasted about taking the lives of 48 people, despite the fact that he's only officially been linked to 3. Hopefully, if this is true, the connections are discovered soon so that the families and loved ones of those victims can receive the justice that they deserve. In our number 1 spot today, we have Gary Ridgeway. This horrible human being is also sometimes known as the Green River Killer, and his crimes took place somewhere between 1982 to potentially as recent as 2001. He was convicted for 49 crimes, but confessed to an unbelievable 71, which makes him the 2nd most prolific serial killer in the United States in terms of confirmed killings. Most of his victims were either sex workers or women in other vulnerable circumstances, and through DNA profiling evidence in 2001, authorities were able to connect him to 4 of his crimes. From there, they made a deal with him where they would spare him the death sentence in exchange for the disclosure of the location of all of the missing women. Gary took the deal and was spared a death sentence, and instead was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Not only did he say that he chose the type of victims he did because they were easy to pick up and that he hated most of them, but he also called his crimes his career. So, he sucks.
Coming in at number 10. Look, for those of us in the acting industry, we know it's a tough cookie to crack. Getting an agent is great, but then getting seen by the right people and then finally getting cast, it's a heartbreaking and addictive biz, but until today, I didn't know just how deadly it could be. In the 1920s, the death of William Desmond Taylor, a silent filmmaker, was found dead in his LA bungalow with a gunshot wound in his back. Unfortunately though, it would be years before the killer would eventually confess on their deathbed. The death of Taylor crushed a lot of dreams and a lot of careers, including the teen star Mary Miles Minter, who according to police had left a nightgown and love letter in his apartment. But years later, Minter wrote an autobiography admitting that her and her mother were both at Taylor's home that night, but still no hint of confession until Minter's mother suffered a heart attack, and one of the sins she confessed to on her deathbed was shooting William Desmond Taylor for making a pass at her daughter. Ooh, sounds like a crazy stage mom to me. Coming in at number 6, the fact that this guy relates the crimes he did to fulfilling a lifelong dream is just one of the chilling confessions of Bernard Giles. He was arrested in 1974 after claiming the lives of 5 women by the age of 21 in Titusville, Florida. According to Giles, he had a very pleasant upbringing and unlike many serial killers, had a kind and normal life. But Bernard says that only he knew he had a dark desire as he got older. At the time of the attacks, he was also married and the father of a young daughter, though he says he doesn't put his family and his victims in the same category. He didn't want to know his victims' names simply because he saw them as objects and nothing more. In the interview with Morgan, he also goes on to say that 3 women saved their own lives because they started talking to him. By doing that, they became real, and because of that, he resisted the temptation. This was the same reason he didn't kill his wife, simply because he knew her. Bernard was just like everyone else, an electrician with a wife and a family. No one knew the monster that lied beneath until it was just too late.
In our number 1 spot today, we have Daniel Wozniak. In 2010, Daniel Patrick Wozniak had his wedding and honeymoon coming up that were of course going to cost a lot of money. Instead of getting a second job or simply just doing, I don't know, literally anything else in the entire world, he decided to do the unthinkable. He ended up taking the life of his neighbor Samuel Hare and his friend Juri Kabushi so that he could steal money from them. It is absolutely insane that this is the story behind the crime, but I cannot make this stuff up. He ended up confessing his crimes to police, and while it is nice to see someone try to show a sliver of remorse, his self-pity truly is just too much, which makes me believe that his remorse has much more to do with the remorse of being caught instead of actually committing the crime. Daniel ended up being apprehended by US Marshals at his bachelor party 2 days before his wedding. The trial was very long, but in 2016 he was found guilty and ended up being sentenced to death. He remains at San Quentin State Prison. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have Margaret Lorraine Smith. Starting off this list with one of the craziest stories on it, Margaret is quite a dangerous woman. She actually is charged with hiring a man to kill her own husband, George Smith. On August 6th, 2007, it is said that she hired a man and lured her husband to Surfside Beach late at night. She left George sitting in the sand as the man she hired carried out her evil, horrible plan. Both Margaret and the man she hired were both indicted on these charges in September of 2007. While the hired man was convicted, Margaret herself has been running from her own actions since August 11th, 2009. She fled while on bond awaiting the start of her trial. We could ask ourselves all day why she was allowed to be released on bond for such a horrific crime, but at the end of the day, it won't help anyone find her. She was last seen on video at a Walmart in San Antonio getting into a maroon 4-door sedan. There are many rewards being offered for anyone who can provide tips that lead to her arrest, and authorities have also released age-progressed photos to show what she may look like now. Hopefully at some point she is caught and brought to justice for the horrible thing that she did. In our number 9 spot today, we have Israel Aguirre. Israel was first arrested in 2002 on the charges of theft as well as being charged for taking someone's life. He was convicted of his theft charge in 2003 and served times at a correctional corrections facility for it. After his sentence was finished, he was deported from the United States before standing trial for the charge related to the killing. In 2005, however, he was arrested once again in Dallas, this time for a different crime as well as for failure to identify himself. He pled no contest and was released on bond. He made a few different court appearances between 2005 and 2007, but eventually he disappeared. On September 9th, 2007, the Kaufman County Sheriff's Office issued a warrant for his arrest for the killing, but he has yet to be seen. In our number 8 spot today, we have Troy James Allison. Born in Houston, Texas in 1953, Troy has quite a criminal history, including convictions in 1973 and 1976 for some very serious crimes. In 1977, he was convicted of a horrifying crime following an incident involving a 22-year-old female. For this, he received a 75-year sentence, which he served up until he was paroled in 2003. Since 2004, however, he has been on the run. He was last seen in the Lufkin area, but is still wanted for his parole violation as well as failing to comply with orders to register as a sex offender. The Most Wanted website lists his past employment history, as he's had jobs as a pipe fitter, welder, and a meat cutter. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Phantom Killer. This is the moniker used to refer to an unidentified serial killer who was active in the spring of 1946. During this time in Texarkana, Texas, whoever this suspect is killed 5 people and injured 3 others over the course of 10 weeks. Many people call this series of crimes the Texarkana Moonlight Killings, and despite best efforts, no one has been able to solve the crimes. Basically, the MO of these incidents involved young couples who had parked their cars on the secluded Lover's Lane at night, and they were the primary targets. The first couple who encountered this monster thankfully survived their attack, and they were able to provide a description which involved the assailant wearing a white sack over his head with holes cut out for the eyes. From all of the urban legends, true crime stories, and just general spooky stories that I've heard, which involves people parking on Lover's Lane, I think it's officially convinced me to never go anywhere near any such kind of place. Because of the time it's been, it's possible that whoever is responsible for these crimes will never be caught. In our number 6 spot today, we have Susan O'Connor. About a month and a half ago, a woman was arrested, and it was found out that she had been on the run for years. 54-year-old Susan O'Connor was pulled over on October 28th for speeding, but what the officers found was more than they likely could have ever imagined. As it turned out, Susan was on the run since 2009 when she fled with her then 3-year-old son. Her fingerprints confirmed her true identity, and she was charged. For 14 years, Susan's son was listed as a missing person, but with Susan being found, the now 17-year-old was finally reunited with his father. It appears as though the reason Susan fled in the first place was to disrupt and interfere with some sort of custody issue that she was having at the time. Susan is now being held at the Collin County Detention Facility in McKinney on warrants for failure to appear and interference with child custody. Her bond has been set at $100,000, and if convicted, she likely will face time in prison. In our number 5 spot today, we have Jose Fernando Bustos Diaz. Back in 2005, Jose was working on a ranch as a hand at the Oaks of Kendallwood stables, which were located in northwest Harris County. As he worked here, he made the terrible decision to take someone's life. He pleaded guilty to the crime once caught and received a 35-year sentence for it. On April 6, 2010, however, this story spun even more out of control when he escaped from his prison unit approximately 70 miles southwest of San Antonio. On that day, the sheriff's office and the jail both issued warrants for his arrest regarding the escape, and on April 13th, the U.S. Marshals Service issued another one pertaining to unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Many people believe that he may have managed to flee the country entirely, but at this point, anyone's guess could possibly be correct. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Servant Girl Annihilator. This horrible name refers to one of America's first known serial killers who is responsible for taking the lives of 7 women woman and one man in Austin, Texas between December of 1884 and December of 1885. All of the victims in this case were members of staff who had either been killed as they slept or dragged out of their beds and killed outside of their homes. There was even one night on December 24th, 1885, where this person took 3 lives in one night. That is horrifying. There have been many people questioned, arrested, and even one likely suspect, but considering the many years it's been, it's safe to say that the one responsible will likely never be found. In our number 3 spot today, we have Brandon Hogan. Brandon has landed himself a spot on the Texas 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list, the most amazing top 10 most wanted fugitives list. He is said to have ties to Coryell County, which includes both the cities of McGregor as well as Gatesville, Texas. The reason he is on the most wanted list is because in 2007 he was convicted of harming someone and it caused a bodily injury, and because of this he received 5 years probation. His probation, however, didn't last long. It was actually revoked the following year and he was instead sentenced to 5 years confinement. In August of this year, however, Brandon was arrested for theft of firearm, burglary of a habitation, assault, and criminal mischief. On September 26, 2002, he escaped from his work crew station and since then has been on the run. In our number 2 spot today, we have Matthew Edgar. Born in 1996, although young, Matthew has quite the history when it comes to run-ins with the law. In 2015, Matthew was convicted of evading arrest as well as causing serious bodily injury, and as a result of this he was sentenced to 3 years of confinement and 3 years of probation. In 2020, things took a way darker turn, however, when he was arrested for taking someone's life. In 2021, he was subsequently arrested for harming a family/household member, which appears to have been by way of impeding their ability to breathe. Earlier this year in January, he was attending his initial days of the trial that was in relation to him taking someone's life before he fled on January 26, 2022. He did end up being convicted in absentia and has been sentenced to 99 years confinement. On January 27, 2022, just a day after he fled, a warrant was issued for his arrest, and hopefully he soon is found so that he can serve the sentence he received from the judge. In our number 1 spot today, we have Patrick Carrier. 3 of the Texas 10 most wanted fugitives quite recently were finally found and brought back into custody, and Patrick is just one of them. After fleeing, Patrick was finally caught and was arrested in Houston on November 21st. He initially was in trouble in 1993 when he was convicted of a killing and received a 45-year sentence for that crime. In 2013, he was convicted again for possession of an illicit substance and was sentenced to 6 months confinement, but was released on parole in October of 2020. This turned out to be a mistake, however, as he totally disappeared, completely violating the terms of his parole, and with a violent history, that is a major cause for concern. At the beginning of 2021, in January, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles issued a warrant for his arrest for a parole violation, and then in March, just a few months later, the Harris County Sheriff's Office issued a warrant for his arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Thankfully, this is one person on this list who was found so that they can finish serving the sentence that they were given.
First up in our number 10 spot, Dan Cooper. Back in 1971, a man who went by the alias Dan Cooper hijacked a commercial plane and no one has ever been able to find him since. According to those involved, shortly after takeoff he handed a note to a flight attendant claiming to have a bomb in his briefcase. He demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills, which is the equivalent of like $1.2 million nowadays. Otherwise, he was going to kill everyone on the plane. After the flight landed in Seattle, Cooper released the 36 passengers once authorities provided him with the money and the parachutes, but he kept both pilots, 1 flight attendant, and 1 flight engineer as hostages on the plane. From there, he forced them to fly to Mexico City, but somewhere over Nevada, Cooper jumped off the plane with the stolen cash. The FBI launched a massive search that is still considered one of the longest and most exhaustive investigations in FBI history. But have yet to find him. And although he isn't on the top 10 list anymore, he is still considered a wanted fugitive. Coming in at number 9, Route 29 Stalker. One cursed area in the state of Virginia, known as Route 29, has unfortunately become notorious due to the number of women who have seemingly vanished there. The first victim of Larry Breeden, or at least that was his alias, was a woman named Alicia Reynolds. She had been seen driving down Route 29 to go shopping with her mother in a nearby town, but never arrived at the mall. Shortly after, another 20 or so women came forward to tell the cops that a creep had tried approaching them, trying to get them to pull over their cars on the country road, attempting to convince them that something was wrong with their cars and that he wanted to help. Shortly after, 3 more women were found dead on the road. Then after a strange 13-year gap in crimes, another 5 women disappeared between 2009 and 2014. To this day, the case of the Route 29 stalker has never been solved, and while there have been a few suspects over the years, no one has been convicted for the crimes. Whoever hurt these women walks free, and authorities are still on the hunt for the perp. Next up at number 8, Bhadresh Kumar Patel. Wanted by the FBI since 2015, Patel could be hiding anywhere. His arrest came, as I said, back in 2015, when he was charged for taking his wife's life. Allegedly, the perp struck her multiple times with a kitchen utensil while the two were working at a donut shop, and then cameras caught him fleeing the scene after the incident. His charges are currently first and second degree assault and a dangerous weapon with intent to injure. The FBI has reason to believe he's fled the country, as apparently his visa expired right before he killed his wife, and there is currently a $100,000 price on his head for anyone with information to his whereabouts. Let's just hope they find him soon. Coming in at number 7, Arnaldo Jimenez. Most people have a romantic honeymoon, at least that's sort of the assumption. But Mr. Arnaldo Jimenez here seemed to have a different plan in mind. Back in 2012, the day after marrying his wife, who, to make matters worse, he already had a family with, Jimenez took her out with some friends to a club. Apparently the couple left around 4 a.m. from the club, and from there, for whatever reason, Jimenez took her life. His wife was stabbed to death in the back of his car before being dragged into the bathroom tub of her apartment and abandoned. Obviously, this creep was charged and a warrant went out for his arrest, and although authorities have reason to believe he may have fled back to Mexico, they haven't actually been able to track him down. To this day, he remains on the FBI's most wanted with a $100,000 reward for his capture. Next up at number 6, Ruslana Ignatova. Maybe it's just me, but a lot of the time when you hear con artists, you tend to think like a slimy person preying on the old and vulnerable through some weird email contest or something. But Ignatova had a different kind of clientele base she was looking to rip off: investors. Currently wanted for participation in a large-scale fraud scheme that involved her defrauding billions of dollars from investors all over the world, Ignatova began her Ponzi scheme back in 2014. It all started with her MLM called Pikon, but from there she moved on to bigger names with deeper pockets. In 2014, she founded OneCoin Limited, which was a Bulgaria-based company that marketed cryptocurrency. But behind the scenes, she was making false statements about the company in order to solicit investments. Later in 2019, her brother came forward admitting it was a money laundering front, but by then, Ignatova had already disappeared. Allegedly, during its active years, OneCoin is believed to have defrauded victims out of more than $4 billion. And not only is she on the FBI's most wanted, but she made her way onto the Interpol's most wanted and has a price on her head for anyone with more information. Coming in at number 5, Alejandro Castillo. Once again, another one of the FBI's most wanted. This criminal has been hiding out since 2016. 6 years ago, Castillo texted his co-worker Sandy Lee, who apparently he had briefly dated prior, saying that he wanted to repay her the money she had loaned him. So under the guise of getting her money back, Lee agreed to meet up with him. But here's where it gets twisty. Castillo had a new girlfriend at the time named Amia Feaster, and the afternoon of the incident, he was picked up by her and she drove the pair to the meetup. Although the full details of the crimes aren't confirmed, it's believed Castillo, instead of giving Lee her money back, held her at gunpoint while forcing her to withdraw all the money she had from a nearby ATM, which was about $1,000. Investigators think Castillo then drove Lee into the woods and took her life before dumping the body into a ravine. From there, Castillo and his current girlfriend Feaster fled in his Toyota Corolla to Mexico. Since then, he hasn't been seen, but his girlfriend turned herself in 2016, confirming they'd been living with Castillo's cousins when they were in hiding. The FBI hasn't been able to track him down just yet, but they do think he remains in Mexico to this day. Jose Rodolfo Villarreal Hernandez, also sometimes referred to as El Gato, this criminal is one of the newer additions to the FBI's most wanted list, having been just added 2 years ago in 2020. But he may be one of the scarier ones yet. A warrant for his arrest was issued back in June of 2018 when El Gato was accused of having involvement with interstate stalking as well as hiring 2 men to assassinate a man named Guerrero back in 2013. Allegedly, the 2 men hired to track down Guerrero and his wife attempted to shoot them down. Guerrero unfortunately did not make it past the attack, but luckily his wife escaped unharmed. The craziest part of all of this is that allegedly Guerrero's sister, after the attack, took revenge on El Gato by having one of his relatives beheaded, which to me sounds like they might have pissed off the wrong people. Currently, the FBI is not sure exactly where El Gato is hiding, but the search continues, with $1 million being the price for anyone who's able to track him down. Next up, at number 3, Eugene K Palmer. Back in 2012, Eugene Palmer was the neighbor to his son and daughter-in-law John and Tammy Palmer. Now, not only was Eugene their neighbor, but he also owned the property that the couple and their family lived on. After some time together, John and Tammy's relationship started to go south, and after the pair separated and began seeing other people, Tammy issued a restraining order against her ex, John. On top of the restraining order, Tammy threatened divorce and to sue for the land belonging to Eugene, and all of this began quite the feud between the two. A few days later, Tammy and Eugene had a very heated argument, and then on September 24th, 2012, Eugene took her life. Allegedly, he shot her 3 times before fleeing the scene in his pickup truck, which was later found abandoned near a park. Now, Eugene was quite the woodsman, so it's believed he fled into the woods, and despite multiple searches, he has never been found. Coming in at number 2, Hazel Leota Head. Back in 1998, under the false name of Deanna Ray, Head conned her way into the heart of an old widower named James Barker. Now, according to the authorities, Head was a drifter who hitchhiked around the country looking for lonely men to latch onto so she could drain their bank accounts before abandoning them high and dry. Charles Barker was a depressed and lonely man after losing his wife, and when he met Deanna, he immediately fell smitten with the con artist. After only days of meeting each other, she moved in, and when his family met her, they had a strange suspicion that something about her wasn't right. After some time, Charles too began to think something with his new girlfriend was off, but he never shared any of the details with his family. Then one day, after not hearing from her father for nearly a week, his daughter called up her aunt, Charles' sister, asking if she could go check up on him and make sure that he was okay. When his sister arrived, she saw that the door was open and she ran inside to find Charles Barker dead, slumped over a bar. Once police arrived, they discovered he'd been dead for 5 days, and Hazel, or Deanna as she called herself, was missing along with Charles's car and money. The car was found later at an airport, and after running a background check, it was revealed she had pulled this same stunt 10 times before. She remains missing, but authorities have not stopped trying to track her down and arrest her for good. And last up in our number 1 spot, Michael James Pratt. Currently on the FBI's top 10 most wanted, there is no doubt in my mind that this monster is the worst on this list. Between approximately 2012 to 2019, Michael Pratt, along with a few accomplices, was involved in recruiting girls to be a part of an adult film production company that he owned and operated. Pratt lured the girls under a Craigslist ad asking for models, and from there he promised payment in exchange for a clothed modeling gig. But sadly, this couldn't have been further from what he had planned for the victims. Beyond the obviously morally despicable stuff they were making these minors do, he would also force past victims into providing false assurance to the girls that their films would never end up online. Allegedly, some of the victims were not permitted to leave shooting locations until the shoot was complete. Others were forced to perform after declining participation, and the crew was known to commit SA when the girls wouldn't comply. After fleeing the country in 2019, right before his trial for his crimes, he was added to the FBI list, and the search for this creep continues.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the Honolulu Killer. This is the moniker given to an unidentified serial killer who was active in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1985 and 1986. Throughout those years, it is said that whoever is responsible for these crimes took the lives of at least 5 women. The women seemingly didn't have any connection to each other as they were all from different walks of life, but because of the gruesome similarities of each crime, authorities were able to determine that they were all likely committed by the same person. Despite the years it's been, the perpetrator has never been identified and could still be out there somewhere, hiding from taking responsibility. Perhaps if there were to be a documentary released about this case, although it's been a number of years, a renewed public interest might end in more leads for those investigating the case. In our number 9 spot today, we have Victor Guerrena. Back in September of 1983, Victor was 25 years old and was a trusted employee of the West Hartford, Connecticut Wells Fargo Express Company, but on September 12th, that all changed. After working throughout the day and completing the scheduled rounds of currency collection from the local banks, Victor held his co-workers hostage before tying them up, handcuffing them, and injecting them with a mysterious substance he claimed would leave them unable to move. After doing this, Victor proceeded to take about $7 million, which was one of the largest cash robberies in US history at the time. His co-workers were later able to get themselves untied and they called the authorities, but by that time, Victor was gone. They found his car, but it had been abandoned, and of course, the money was gone. They later found out that Victor was part of a larger group who had orchestrated this entire thing, and they also found out that part of the money was used to purchase a surface-to-air missile that was later launched at FBI headquarters in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Thankfully, it turned out to be a huge waste of money because it did little damage, and fortunately, no one was injured. 2 years later, there were 14 people who were arrested in Puerto Rico, Massachusetts, and Texas as they were found to be involved in the entire operation, but Victor once again escaped capture and has not been seen since. This case is honestly just a crazy story. I could have been convinced that this was the plot of a heist movie and not a real-life scenario. In our number 8 spot today, we have Arthur Shawcross. This man is also known as the Genesee River Killer, and his crime spree began in 1972, and Arthur was sure to commit some of the worst kinds of crimes. After the first 2 of his crimes, he was apprehended, but for some insane reason they allowed him to have a plea bargain where he was allowed to plead guilty to just 1 charge of only manslaughter, for which he served 14 years of his 25-year sentence. In the least surprising turn of events, once he was released on early probation, his real crime spree got started. He would go on to take the lives of 12 women from 1988 to 1989. Thankfully, he was finally caught for these crimes and sent right back to prison. Of course, his initial early release, however, was the subject of huge controversy, and Dr. Michael H. Stone, who's the professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, called his early release one of the most egregious examples of the unwarranted release of a prisoner. Although Arthur ended up passing away in prison while serving a 250-year sentence, a documentary about him in this story could be quite interesting. It would be really intriguing to see just how this horrible person ended up being released, how that sort of thing happens, what we can do to prevent it. You know, a lot could be learned from this specific case. In our number 7 spot today, we have the West Mesa Bone Collector. This is the name used to describe an unidentified serial killer who is said to be responsible for taking the lives of 11 different women whose remains were found buried in the desert of West Mesa in 2009. Despite this story being international news, it remains unsolved, which might be a reason for it to be made into a new Netflix doc. It is thought that this could be one person, or it could potentially be linked to some sort of group. There have been tips throughout the years, and authorities have worked hard to try and get to the bottom of these crimes, but still, the killer remains at large. There have been a few different suspects throughout the years, but there hasn't been enough concrete evidence to charge anyone with the crimes. What's really interesting about this case is that although the remains were found in 2009, according to authorities, upon examining satellite images, it is believed that the last of the remains were were placed there in 2005. In our number 5 spot today, we have Monica Witt. Monica is a former United States Air Force technical sergeant as well as a defense contractor who has been on the run since 2018. Despite her high-ranking position and high security clearance, she is on the run because she defected to Iran in 2013. It is said that from 2013 up until she was found out, she was using her position in order to spy on the United States and relay that information back to the group she was working for. She used different fake Facebook accounts, and it is said that the information she gave included the classified true name and counterintelligence activities of a US intelligence operative. This is of course a problem regardless of how important this operative was, but it is said that this information she shared had the potential to cause serious damage to the United States national security. It truly is an absolutely wild story, and Monica is still out there on the run, hiding from the consequences of her betrayal and espionage. Not only could a documentary shed some light in on this case and possibly lead to someone who knows her coming forward, but the story really is just insane, and there's tons of turns, and how high security everything is really just ups the stakes. In our number 4 spot today, we have Scott Lee Kimball. This is a man who took the lives of at least 4 people between the years of 2003 and 2004, but I say the words at least because although it's never been able to be proven, it is thought that he actually took the lives of somewhere around 20 plus people. During the first 2 of his crime-filled years, Scott actually worked as an FBI informant, but to none of our surprise now, he was one of the worst informants of all time. Not only did he rarely provide any sort of evidence that ended up actually being useful, but much of the evidence he provided ended up later being proven false. Watching a documentary about how that happened would be super interesting. As he's in the midst of committing crimes, he's also having meetings and phone calls with the FBI. That's some Walter White level stuff. He was caught in 2006 not only for these horrific crimes, but many others as well, which included things like fraud and forgery. He ended up being sentenced to 70 years in prison, and he still is currently serving that sentence. In our number 3 spot today, we have Israel Keyes. Israel is quite a prolific serial killer and truly a terrifying person. While everyone on this list is horrible, Israel is particularly scary because of the fact that he had no MO or type. He just killed at random. Like, he was so prepared for these random crimes that he left kill kits all over the US so that he would be prepared for whenever, whoever he chose crossed his path. It isn't quite clear how many of these crimes he committed, and many missing persons reports that are still open could potentially be linked to him. It is said that Israel had a sort of admiration and obsession with other prolific serial killers like Ted Bundy or Robert Hansen. He even said, quote, "I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about. It's kind of a hobby of mine." I don't know, taking true crime a little too seriously. In March of 2012, Israel was finally apprehended and was to stand trial for his crimes, but unfortunately while awaiting trial he went on to take his own life. He left behind a note and a drawing of 11 skulls, which led authorities to believe that this may be the number of victims he had. This is just one of the most terrifying true crime stories and would definitely make for quite a horrifying documentary. In our number 2 spot today, we have the vending machine killer. In 1985 in Hiroshima, there were 12 people who passed away and 35 people who were seriously injured from being poisoned with a chemical herbicide. When this string of poisonings were investigated, authorities realized that they all had one thing in common, and that was the fact that they had all had the same drink shortly before falling ill. So around the time of this whole thing, there was a company that had launched a marketing campaign where they gave a free drink with every purchase that was made from a vending machine. When people didn't want their free drink, they would leave it on top of the vending machine for the next person who came along, which is super nice and thoughtful and kind, and of course that means that some horrible person out there had to ruin it for everyone. So as it turns out, someone was taking these drinks, lacing them with poison, and then leaving them on top of the machines for some random stranger to come around and drink it and then be sick or pass away. It is almost impossible for authorities to be able to track down whoever was doing this because you have to narrow down where the person picked up the drink, and in 1985 there weren't as many CCTV cameras as there are now. So unfortunately, whoever was responsible for a mass poisoning of strangers is still out there somewhere. A documentary about this would definitely be interesting to watch, but because it is still unsolved, having the story on a huge platform like Netflix might just help get it out there and perhaps bring in more leads. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have Nero. To start off this list, we are going to be taking it back all the way to the age of the Roman Empire. When we think back to these times, they weren't necessarily the most kind, peaceful of times, but there certainly are some characters that stand out as being particularly brutal, and one of those is Nero. Throughout his reign, he wreaked havoc on the Roman Empire, he burned cities, he killed thousands of people including every member of his own family, and I mean, we know the inventive execution methods of the past, so you can probably guess at just how brutal these all were. Most Roman sources give us an almost completely negative review of him in reference to both his personality and his reign as a leader. He was called compulsive and corrupt, and it is believed that he is actually to blame for the great fire that burned Rome, but instead he used the Christians as a scapegoat so that they would receive punishments rather than him. Real stand-up guy. In the end, after being declared a public enemy by the Roman Senate and realizing that the rebellion would be lost, he ended up taking his own life at the age of 30. In our number 8 spot today, we have Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine was a New Orleans socialite who was an evil person behind closed doors. It is said that in public, Delphine was polite and appeared as if she cared for those who were enslaved in her home, which is truly the most bizarre sentence I've ever said, but I guess back then that was considered being a good person. I digress. Delphine's social standing remained until on April 10th, 1834, authorities responded to a fire at her Royal Street mansion. When they arrived and went inside, no one was prepared for the horrors that they were about to see, as they discovered bound slaves in her attic who had clear signs of violent behavior over a long period of time. Following this, her house was swarmed by an outraged group of New Orleans citizens, but somehow Delphine was able to escape with her family to France. While the angry group destroyed her entire home, Delphine never faced any punishments for her crimes, which is probably the most frustrating ending to this entire story. In our number 7 spot today, we have Alexander Solonic. Alexander was known as Alexander the Great, but I'm not sure if great is the word I would use to describe him. He was a Russian gangster who was a pretty notorious hitman for the Russian criminal world. He started out as a member of the Soviet army, but he was quickly kicked out for his violence towards suspects. He actually ended up in prison for some of the things he did. After 2 years, he ended up escaping, and this is when his contract killing career started. After a few years of living this life, he was apprehended by the police. Once at the station, he revealed a small automatic weapon that they had failed to find on him, and he opened fire on the officers. He ran outside where he hit 2 more officers, but he ended up cornered and hit by a shot himself. After being jailed for a second time, he ended up escaping from prison again, and this time he disappeared. He was later found in Greece with a fake passport, and it was here where he started his own little gang of around 50 men, which were of course all involved in shady activities. In 1997, however, his body was found just outside of Athens, and this time the tables had turned and he was someone else's victim. Authorities found evidence that he had been hired to carry out a hit in Italy before his death, and these two things just may be correlated. In our number 6 spot today, we have Elizabeth Wettlaufer. Elizabeth is a former registered nurse and serial killer who was responsible for taking the lives of 8 and attempting to take the lives of another 6 senior citizens who were under her care. With a total of 14 victims that either passed away or were harmed by her actions, she is now one of the worst serial killers Canada has ever seen. And not to mention how she was doing these things to vulnerable people that she was supposed to have devoted her life to taking care of. Her first victim who passed away was James Silcox, who was 84 in 2007 and was a World War II veteran. She committed her crimes by injecting insulin into her patients. In September of 2016, Liz ended up entering herself into a drug rehabilitation program at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which is located here in Toronto. It was here that she ended up confessing to her horrific crimes. Of course, the staff at the hospital notified the proper authorities, and she was subsequently arrested, and she gave police a 2-hour-long confession. She admitted to knowing that what she did was wrong, but she said she just had urges she couldn't control. She stated that, quote, God or the devil or whatever wanted me to do it. In the end, she was sentenced to life in prison, but because of the way that the Canadian system works, at some point she will be eligible for parole. In our number 5 spot today, we have Pedro Lopez. Pedro is a man who lived a life committing some of the most horrific crimes I've ever even heard of throughout South America in the 1970s. By the time the 1980s rolled around, he made a mistake during one of his awful crimes, and this led to his arrest. Once in police custody, he began to basically explain his entire life story, and he confessed to an astronomical amount of crimes. People were a little skeptical of just how many crimes he said he committed, but Pedro was able to lead them to a mass grave where they recovered a total of 53 people's remains. Pedro, of course, went to jail, but get this, he was somehow released in 1994. I'm like, great. just before I was born. Nice. He wasn't sent home straight away and instead was sent to some sort of mental institution for 3 years, but he was also released from there. Okay, so aside from the crimes he committed, are you ready for the worst part? In 2002, he was suspected of being the perpetrator of a new crime, but no one has been able to find him since 1998. Yeah, he disappeared. Awesome. In our number 4 spot today, we have Elsa Cook. Elsa is a war criminal who oversaw concentration camps that were run by her husband, Carl Otto Cook. She is well known due to her sadistic and brutal treatment of prisoners, and she became one of the first well-known people that committed these types of crimes to be tried by the US military. It is said that those being held at the camps with distinctive tattoos, Elsa would take a piece of their skin as souvenirs. When being charged with her crimes, they included things like private enrichment, embezzlement, as well as taking the lives of some prisoners to prevent them from testifying. In the original trial, she was acquitted for lack of evidence, although her husband was sentenced to death by an SS court in Munich. After a few more trials, however, she ended up being sentenced to life in prison, and despite multiple appeal attempts, she was never released. In our number 3 spot today, we have Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a Georgian revolutionary and Soviet political leader who governed the Soviet Union from 1922 until his death in 1953. Despite the fact that he started his time governing the country as part of a collective leadership, by the 1930s he had consolidated all of the power and went on to begin acting as the Soviet Union's dictator. During his reign, Stalin was responsible for the deaths of over 60 million people, 20 million of them being his own. Apparently the math works out to be about 40,000 people per week, which is truly unbelievable. It is worth noting, especially since this list is about people who were born evil, that there were good things that he did at some point or another. I mean, Stalin's forces did start out as an Axis power in World War II, and he did help us out a great deal and helped to bring down you-know-who, but in the end, that good can't eliminate the harm that he did. Also, before he was in power, it is said that as a young man, he was a robber and an assassin. For almost 30 years, he reigned the Soviet Union with terror and violence. I mean, his decisions led to a famine that killed millions of people alone. Also, the lives he took weren't just of enemies. I mean, how could one person have 60 million enemies? He would take the lives of the families of people he liked. He just took too many lives, was too paranoid, and while he was powerful and smart, he was also an absolute monster. This is all perfectly summed up when he said, quote, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is simply a statistic." In our number 2 spot today, we have Pol Pot. Pol Pot was the leader of the Cambodian revolutionary group called the Khmer Rouge, and this group, with him at the forefront, went on to try and destroy Cambodian civilization. This wasn't necessarily how the group started out, but once Pol and others who shared his ideas came to lead it, things quickly became dark. He is likely one of the only people who ordered a mass genocide in his own country. The reasoning behind all of this is because he believed that destroying the civilization was the best way to start a new regime and bring in a new age. He ended up serving as the prime minister from 1976 until 1979, during which his policies led to the deaths of around 2 million people, which is horrifying. That was about 25% of the entire population. He even liked to keep the skulls of those he had killed. I'm just gonna say, it seems as though politics was the mask for someone who just really wanted to kill. There are so many horrific details surrounding him and the things he did, some of which I can't even repeat here on YouTube, and that is exactly how he landed a spot here on today's list. He truly did some horrendous things and in the end went on to live the rest of his life and died of natural causes before he could answer for any of his crimes.
Number 10. Albert Fish. Albert is one of the oldest people on this list, but that does not mean his crimes were any less horrific than anyone else's. Yeah, he was nicknamed the Brooklyn Vampire, or the Moon Maniac, or the Boogeyman. By its name alone, you could probably guess what he did to bodies. Yeah, it's horrible. I can't even talk about it on YouTube. Albert was a terrible human being who did terrible things. Now, in the early 1900s, Albert was arrested, tried, and convicted for killing and consuming 3 people, but the horror was not over yet. Yeah. No, Albert began to claim that although people knew about 3, that number, the real number, was actually close to 100 victims. And he even claimed that he had some in every single state, which is impossible to find now, honestly, and it's horribly disgusting to think about. To make matters even worse, as if it wasn't already terrible enough, he also sent a letter to the mother of one of his victims, and he detailed everything about how he lured the victim in and the rest of these horrible things that occurred afterwards. Number 9. The alphabet. yet to be identified. Guess I'm not sleeping tonight. Yeah, we're talking cold cases in this list. We're talking unsolved crimes right now, and we're talking about one of the worst. The alphabet killings are a series of unsolved crimes named because of how each victim had first initials that matched their last. So like their first and last name started with the same letter, that type of thing. Details on how the lives were taken and where the remains were placed afterwards, it just connected, right? They were all taken in a similar area around the same time. There are theories and suspects as to who could have committed these horrific crimes, but as of right now, no one knows for sure. These crimes were committed between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York, and because of the timing, it's possible that whoever committed these crimes could still be alive, and perhaps they're not. Who knows? Number 7, the Long Island Killer. What would a list of horrifying people be without some of the most dreaded unidentified serial killers, right? The most unidentified ones are always the most creepy. The Long Island Killer, of course, operated in the Long Island region and is said to have begun being active right back in the 1996 area, and it's entirely possible that they may currently still be active. Again, it's so recent where it's like, possibly. Recent enough? Maybe. At the moment, there's a range of 10 to 17 crimes that authorities believe could be linked to this yet to be identified person. Unfortunately, there's not much that's known about this person or who they might be or anything like that, although it's currently thought that they're likely a white male in his mid-20s to 40s with extensive knowledge of law enforcement operations and techniques, and they believe this because it would make sense as to why he's been so successful in avoiding capture so far. Number 6, the Doodler. The nickname that this unidentified killer received is due to his practice of sketching his victims before taking their lives. This unidentified killer committed their crimes in the San Francisco area from January 1974 to September 1975, and they specifically targeted the LGBTQ community. It's believed that 14 deaths can be attributed to this killer, while 3 others were injured in the process. Unfortunately, because of stigma and the sensitivities surrounding gay men at the time, the 3 who did survive this monster were very reluctant when speaking with authorities for fear of being, outed as a result of it. This has led, of course, to there being little information for them to work with in terms of identifying the man responsible. For a while, there was a primary suspect, but that person has never been officially charged because sadly, none of the survivors felt comfortable enough to testify in court. There's a very real chance that authorities know who the killer is, but just don't have the evidence yet to prove it in a court of law. The most terrifying thought of all. Number 5. Tex Watson. Tex Watson was one of the central members of the Manson family, which was led, of course, by Charles Manson, and was a willing participant for all of those crimes, specifically the crimes that took place August 9th and 10th, 1969. In October 1969, Tex knew his arrest was coming, so he fled to his home state of Texas, but was later arrested and then, sent back to California, of course. Now, once he was in California, he refused to talk or eat and ended up losing 55 pounds, which got him sent to get tested to see if he was fit to stand trial, which at that time he was. In 1971, he was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit. He originally received a death sentence, but it ended up being a commuted to life in prison sentence. While in prison, apparently this guy's been living the life, it seems, because not only has he been able to release a book while inside, but he also got married, and through visits, he fathered 4 children with her. Number 4, Richard Ramirez. Richard, who is also known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer who terrorized the streets of LA back in the 80s. He was known for invading homes, which left him initially being dubbed as the walk-in killer, but he had another signature that was, of course, concerning to many people. This was during the height of the satanic panic, so yeah, buckle up. Richard was known for leaving behind different satanic messages at the scene of all of his crimes. Because of his satanic signature, after he left his first pentagram at the scene of a crime, authorities became worried that he was a Charles Manson copycat. But instead, he was just his own, one-of-a-kind monster. It is said that he would leave more pentagrams behind while also telling his victims to swear to Satan instead of swearing to God. During his court appearances, he would hold up a pentagram, and after pleading not guilty, he said, "Hail Satan." Number 3, Charles Cullen. He used to be a nurse, and he took the lives of his patients throughout his career, and he may be one of the worst serial killers ever recorded. He confessed to taking the lives of 40 people, but through following interviews, it became apparent that the number was way higher than 40. Yeah, he just couldn't remember the names of them all. Yeah, just that many he couldn't remember. But he of course could remember the details of his crimes against them. His crimes started in 1988 and spanned over a decade into 2003. In October 2003, when a patient passed away from low blood sugar, the authorities were called. This person was Charles' final victim, and authorities began looking into him and investigating his past employment history. On December 12, 2003, authorities were arresting him and charging him with only 1 count of his crimes, but he ended up admitting to 40. He ended up pleading guilty to his crimes and arranged a plea deal where authorities would would not seek the death penalty if he cooperated. During one of his court proceedings, he continually asked the judge to step down, and apparently he repeatedly chanted, "Your Honor, you need to step down." He repeatedly chanted that over and over, 25 minutes straight. Even after he was restrained and gagged for his outbursts, he kept going. It's thought that his victims might be up in the 400 range, which is truly just unbelievable and so tragic. But Charles was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences and will be eligible for parole in 2403. Nice. And finally, number 1, Charlene Gallego. A match made in hell, it seems. Here we go. Back in the late 70s, Charlene Gallego, alongside her twisted husband, Gerald, they were the worst in Sacramento, California. They kidnapped and then later killed 10 victims. But when they kidnapped them, they kept them and then they abused them for a while, horribly, before ultimately ending their lives. It really was the most twisted situation possible. Just disgusting people. Now, cut to 1984, Charlene pleads guilty to murder and receives 16 years. Her husband was waiting for execution, but he died of cancer before meeting that fate, so nice. But Charlene, she got out and moved to Fair Oaks, California, where she has since changed her name. So we have no idea where she is or who she is, so you can sleep on that.
At number 10 is the Hachishaku-sama. Known as the Japanese Slender Man, this Japanese legend makes Slender Man seem like a walk in the park. First up, she's tall. I mean, imagine peeking out your window and seeing an 8-foot tall lady staring back at you. Instant chills. And when she gets close, she makes this spine-tingling sound like kind of giving you a heads up that she's coming. But here's where it gets really scary. She only goes after individuals who haven't been on Earth for very long. Why? Well, some think it's because she feeds off their energy or potential, and also because they're easier to lure. Plus, she can mimic voices, even your loved ones, trying to trick you into opening up your door, and poof, you're gone. And get this, once you see her, you're pretty much marked for doom. There's a ritual to shake her off, and it involves some Buddha statues, salt, and leaving Japan forever. Pretty tough deal. Oh, and she rocks this long white dress, a classic ghostly choice, but the kicker is that she can actually appear as quite attractive, despite being so tall, which makes her scarier. In a nutshell, she's like this vengeful spirit ramped up with this scary look, an eerie sound, and a taste for younger people. Super spooky. At number 9 is the Highway of Tears Unaliver. Now, while the US normally comes to mind when thinking about serial unaliver phenomena, Canada is actually home to a plethora of unsolved serial unalivings. Great. The notorious Highway of Tears in British Columbia, spanning 450 miles between Prince George and Prince Rupert, harbors a haunting legacy of tragedy. Approximately 18 to 40 individuals, primarily indigenous women, have either disappeared or met a tragic end along this route from 1969 to 2011. This chilling series of incidents spans over 5 decades, indicating the potential involvement of multiple perpetrators. Law enforcement, particularly the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, faced immense challenges in solving these cases. Regrettably, only one unaliving led to prosecution, leaving 17 other cases unsolved. The complexity lies in the multiple unalivers suspected lurking along the highway, making tracking their actions over the years incredibly difficult. While authorities have linked one individual to a couple of the unalivings, the majority remain unattributed. The shadow of these unsolved cases suggests the likely existence of additional culprits who have yet to be apprehended. If you're enjoying this spooky video so far, please support the channel by pressing like, subscribing to Most Amazing, and ringing that notification bell. I don't see why not, because it is free, and it helps us out, so please do that. At number 8 is the Sitter. The Oakland County minor unaliver, also referred to as the Sitter, was an unidentified serial assailant responsible for the unalivings of at least 4 young people in Oakland County, Michigan between 76 and 77. This individual earned the moniker due to a pattern observed in the crimes where each victim was bathed before the tragic events, leading the authorities to speculate on potential psychological motives behind the unaliver's actions. The impact of the crimes reverberated profoundly, causing widespread fear and concern among parents throughout Michigan. Numerous community watch programs were initiated, emphasizing the need for heightened vigilance and safety measures for the vulnerable. Despite exhaustive investigative efforts and several leads, including a vehicle linked to the perpetrator, the case still remains unsolved. A significant breakthrough occurred in 2012 when a DNA profile was obtained, but unfortunately, no match was found within law enforcement databases or associated with any arrests made in connection to the case. The extended duration of the victim's captivity, lasting from several days to nearly 3 weeks, adds to the disturbing nature of these tragic events. Number 7 is the Smiling Man. The Smiling Man is a chilling narrative that comes from someone's real experience on a late night walk. This story was shared on a Reddit forum called r/letsnotmeet. So now the thing is, this thread is for real life encounters, not made up stories. It describes an eerie encounter with a man on a quiet Seattle street, and it goes a little something like this. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I enjoyed taking late-night walks to pass the time, but one night, while strolling near a quiet park, something eerie happened. As I turned onto a side street, I noticed a man dancing in the distance. Movement seemed odd, like a waltz with an unusual forward step. Initially, I assumed he might be intoxicated, so I moved to give him some space. However, as he drew nearer, his graceful movements surprised me. His appearance was unsettling. He was tall, thin, and wore an old suit. His eyes were wide, gazing up into the sky, and his smile seemed unnatural. I decided to cross the street, feeling uncomfortable, but when I glanced back, he stood motionless, staring at me with that unsettling smile. Though I tried to put distance between us, he vanished briefly, only to reappear even closer. Feeling unnerved, I quickly walked away, yet each time I looked back, he appeared closer and closer. This continued until he started to move rapidly towards me. Despite feeling frozen in fear, I eventually fled to a more illuminated area, losing sight of the creepy smiling man. At number 6 is the expressionless woman. Now this one is just demonic. There was an infamous incident in 1972 at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles when a woman, devoid of any facial expression akin to that of a mannequin, enters the hospital's premise, her gown stained with the bodily fluids of a kitten with its remains still clenched in her jaw. The hospital staff tried to aid her, but things took a nightmarish turn. After a brief cooperation, she turned hostile, attacking the staff. Security intervention led to her biting a guard's jugular. When questioned about her identity, she ominously declared herself as God before just vanishing, leaving behind the legend of the expressionless woman. At number 5 is the graveyard demon of Dagestan. This was a spooky legend in Russian history. Different folks in Dagestan told stories about this eerie creature, and they all had a similar picture in mind. They saw it as a tall, thin thing dressed in white, sometimes with a face you couldn't see. Could be invisible or look like a real being. Now, the demon liked to hang out in graveyards or empty houses, making creepy sounds at night. Some folks thought only bad people could see it, while others believed it could scare anybody. Legend said that the demon was once a person who didn't get enough gifts after they passed away, or it was a bad person who turned into this scary thing. The details are not very clear. People who encountered this thing felt weak or sick afterwards, like it drained their energy. Some thought you could prevent bad stuff by saying some special prayers or doing rituals like hanging an empty eggshell or nail to protect the living from their relatives. Kinda weird. At number 4 is the Roanoke demon. Roanoke Island's tale is a fascinating mystery from American history. That rhymed. In the late 16th century, a group of English settlers arrived at Roanoke in what is now North Carolina. They established a colony, but things took a bizarre turn when their colony leader, John White, went back to England for supplies. When White returned a few years later, he found the settlement deserted with no signs of struggle or battle. The clues were dismantled, and the only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved on a post, and crow on a nearby tree. Now, some people think that the settlers might have integrated with local natives, the Croatoans, but there's another chilling theory. Now, I'm gonna assert that this claim comes from the internet and not from the Croatoans themselves, but supposedly, legends among the Native American tribes spoke of an ancient ritual to summon a powerful entity, a demon, meant to protect their land from intruders. It's said that this ritual was performed when they felt their territory was threatened by outsiders, and according to these legends, the settlers' disappearance might have been linked to this ritual, a desperate attempt by the indigenous people to protect their land from the encroaching colonizers. At number 3 is the Zerdiaj. Imagine a creature wandering the streets at night, peeking through windows and giving everybody the creeps. Meet the Zerdiaj, a character from Russian folklore. The Zerdiaj was super tall and skinny, like a long tree trunk without its branches. Sort of like a sad wanderer, condemned to wander aimlessly forever. People don't really know much about him, just that he liked scaring folks by peeking into their homes or warming his hands in chimneys. But here's where it gets more interesting. Some stories link Zerdiaj to a big bad guy named Koshchi the Immortal. Koshchi was a typical bad dude in Slavic tales, a skinny tall elder or a wandering skeleton who used magic and kidnapped little people. And guess what? No hero could easily beat him. Now, we're not totally sure about the connection between these two characters, because there's not a lot of info about these guys in Russian folklore. At number 2 is the Chupacabra Man. The Chupacabra is a legendary creature known for attacking livestock, especially goats, and drinking their bodily fluids like a vampire. But what if I told you that there might be another mysterious figure behind behind these goat unalivings. In a small Mexican village, farmers had been losing their goats in bizarre ways. Now most blamed the chupacabra, depicting the mysterious cryptid creature demon thing, but apparently the chupacabra might have actually been a real person. It was rumored that this mysterious being had a deep-seated grudge against the farmers, seeking revenge for an ancient betrayal. You see, legend has it that this figure was once a respected herder in the valley. However, when a severe drought struck, the farmers accused him of stealing their water supply to save his own herd, as most of the other farmers' flock had perished, but not his. They then proceeded to totally pillage the dude. However, this farmer lived, vanished into the shadows, and swore vengeance, which he got by, apparently, sucking the juices out of the other farmers' goats. Yeah, seems legit. At number 1 is the Servant Annihilator. This dude takes the top spot, as this unsolved case is actually one of the very first American serial unalivers. Oh goody. This creepy person went around unaliving 7 women and a man in Austin, Texas between 84 and 85. Now what's chilling is that all these victims worked as house helpers, and this guy attacked them while they were sleeping or pulled them out of their homes to unalive them. In one really scary night in 1885, this unaliver used an axe to unalive 3 people, earning himself the nickname the Austin Axe Unaliver. The police back then had a hard time figuring things out, and all the records are pretty spotty since it happened over 125 years ago. Some people think that the Axe Unaliver might have been Jack the Ripper, who caused chaos in London a few years later. However, other people think it's a local guy named Nathan Elgin, who had a distinctive foot with only 4 toes, matching footprints found on the crime scene. He was unalived by a police officer in 1886 while trying to help a woman named Julia from this drunk dude attacking her outside a saloon. Thankfully, this terrifying unaliver is long gone, considering it happened so many years ago. I mean, if it was in fact this dude and not Jack the Ripper.